Now that you have the REST API endpoints for creating resources, we're going to focus on the REST API endpoints for reading resources. As we explored earlier in the little visualization, there are going to be two. One that allows us to get back a list of multiple items, and one that allows us to target a specific item by its unique identifier. Let's go ahead and kick things off with the two routes for users in this video. That is your challenge for the next video. You'll be doing the same thing for tasks down below. Now let's get started by setting up the route handler for fetching multiple users. app.get to set up the get request, then the path /users. After that, we have the callback function where we get access to the request and to the response. From here, we're going to go ahead and actually use Mongoose to fetch all of the users from the database. Now, Mongoose provides us with a series of methods similar to those we saw with the MongoDB native driver. Let's take a quick moment to explore where we can find these before we use our first one. Over in Google Chrome, I'll be navigating over to my Mongoose tab, and in the documentation under Guides, we're looking for the Queries guide. This contains a list of all of the methods we have access to directly on the model. So directly on uppercase U user or uppercase T task. Here I have methods for some of the other CRUD operations we already know how to create. Right here I have find methods for the reading operations. I have two update methods for updating one or many, and I have methods for deleting one or many documents. So we'll be using these in order to achieve our goal. Now, when it comes to fetching multiple, we use the find method, and the find method accepts a query, an object, just like we saw with the native driver. So over here, what am I going to do? Well, for users, what I'll be doing is calling user.find. Now, find accepts as its first argument an object where we could refine our search criteria. For example, we could try to find users where name equals Andrew, similar to what we did with the MongoDB native driver. In this case, we don't want to do any searching, so we're going to go ahead and leave it as an empty object. This is going to fetch all users stored in the database. Now, we get access to those via the promise that find returns. The promise will be fulfilled with the users if things go well, or it'll be rejected with an error if things go wrong. Right here, that means we set up a call to .then, and we go ahead and provide our callback function. If this function runs, that means things went well, and we'll have access to the users right here, users. If things go poorly, we will set up the catch call. This is going to get access to the error, and we'll be able to go ahead and respond appropriately. Let's go ahead and talk about the success case. If we are able to query for the users, what do we want to do? Well, we want to go ahead and send them back. So what I'll do is use response.send to provide that array of users as the response. Now, before we worry about handling any errors, let's go ahead and make sure this is at least working. What I'm going to do is head over to Postman, and we're going to create a new request in that task app collection. Right here, let's go ahead and add a request. I'll pick a name for it. I can call this one something like read users. I will save it, and we'll go ahead and set up the details by clicking on it. So right here, we have read users, and we're going to leave this as a GET request. Then we'll provide the URL. That would be localhost port 3000 /users. Now, we already have a route handler for /users, but that was a post request. That is completely different from the one we're using here with the GET request. Now, if I go ahead and fire this off, I would expect to see an array of users coming back, and that is exactly what I have. Right here, I have all of my users showing up as expected. I have my Andrews and my one Andrew Mead. Now, one thing we want to make sure we do as we build out our various requests is save them. Up above, I can see that all of them have this little circle, meaning that changes have been made to the request that haven't been saved. Right here, we can click the save button for each, or we can use Command S on a Mac. That would be Control S on other operating systems. So make sure you do save your requests so we can easily access them in the future and rerun them exactly as we ran them before. Now back in Visual Studio Code, we can make sure that we do something when we can't connect to the database and actually get the users. In this case, I'll be using response.status to set up a 500 status code. Right here, 500, which is an internal server error. So in this case, we would see this run if something like the database connection was lost. Right here, we'll then use .send, and we actually don't need to send anything back. We can just send back the response with the status code, letting them know that the service is currently down. Now let's move on to the second get handler we're going to set up for users. This one is going to allow us to fetch an individual user by ID. So we'll still be using app.get, but the path is going to look a bit different. The path will start off much the same way. It'll start off with /users/, but then what comes after that / is going to be dynamic. It's going to be the ID of the particular user you're trying to fetch, and that's obviously going to change as you make requests to this endpoint. One time it might be something like AE, another time the ID might be 12. So what we want to do is capture whatever value is put right here after this second / and get access to it in the route handler so we can fetch the user correctly. To do that, Express gives us access to something called route parameters. These are parts of the URL that are used to capture dynamic values, and it looks a little bit like this. After the /, we add a colon followed by a name. We can pick whatever name we like. I'm going to use ID. So essentially we're saying someone's going to make a GET request to /users / something. When that happens, I want this route handler to run, the one I'm setting up right now, and I want to be able to access the dynamic value they provided inside of here, and that's exactly what we're going to be able to do. Request gives us access to request.params. This contains all of the route parameters that were provided. In this case, it is an object with a single property ID, and the value for ID is whatever was put inside of the URL. Let's mess around with this. What I'm going to do is wrap the request.params in a console.log call so I can print those out, and I'm not even going to send back a response. Now, obviously, that's not what we want in the long term, but for this little demonstration, it's okay if the request times out because no response is ever sent. Let's save the file to restart the server and test things out from Postman. Right here, I'll be adding a new request, and we can call this something like read user singular. I'm going to go ahead and save that, and we'll set up the correct URL. I'll click the request in the collections list. Over here, that is localhost :3000 /users / some value. This could be anything. As an example, let's just enter a bunch of random numbers inside of here. You don't have to match up with mine exactly. We're going to click send, and down below, we're going to see the loading screen forever because we never send back a response. But over inside of Visual Studio Code down below, I can see what's stored on that params object. Right here, I have ID, and it is the ID value I typed as part of the URL. So now that we know how we can extract that value, we'll be able to actually fetch the user, if any, and get that sent back. Right here, let's go ahead and start that process. I'm going to create a new const. I'm going to call this _ID, and then I'm going to get its value from request.params right here ID, which matches up with what we had up above and what we were seeing when we logged out the params object down below. The next thing we want to do is use another one of those query methods to actually fetch the user. Over in the Mongoose documentation, there are two main ways we can fetch a single item. We have find1 and we have find by ID. So I could use find1 if I'm trying to find a user by something else, like maybe their email address. I can use find by ID if I'm trying to find them by their ID, which is exactly what we're trying to do here. So with find1, we provide an object with our search criteria. With find by ID, we just provide the ID. Right here for us, that would be user.find find by ID, and we provide the ID which we just grabbed up above. Now we can set up our promise methods. We have our then call if we did indeed get the user back. Right here, we're going to have access to that user as the argument. And then down below, we'll also set up a call to catch if we were not able to complete that query successfully. And right here, if that's the case, we'll have access to the error. Now, what exactly do we want to do inside of our first callback function when the promise is fulfilled? It's important to remember once again that a MongoDB query is not considered a failure if we don't get any results back when we're looking for something. That's considered a success. MongoDB was able to find everything you asked for and get it back to you correctly, even if it was nothing because there was no matches. That means this first function is going to run, but we might not always have a user. There's a chance that we weren't able to find a user with that ID, in which case we would have no value here. So we'll use a little bit of conditional logic to once again keep things nice and organized. If there is no user, we'll go ahead and run some code. I'm using return to stop the function execution, though I could always use an else clause to do something similar. And right here, what are we going to do? We're going to send back a 404 saying the user was not found. So that would be response.status, setting it equal to 404, then .send. Perfect. Now, if our actual catch function runs, we'll do something similar to what we did up above, response.status 500 and using send to send that back. Now, the only thing left to do is send back the response when things go well, and that's going to happen right here. In this case, we want to make sure to send that data back. So right here, what I'll do is use response.send to send back the individual user. Now, in this case, I'm not explicitly changing the status code, which means the status will be 200, and that's perfectly fine for our endpoints that involve fetching a resource. Now let's go ahead and actually test this out. Over inside of Postman, we're going to fire off the exact same request we had before. This is going to be seen as the ID, and we're not going to find any record with that ID, and down below we get a 404 as expected. Now let's use a valid ID and see what we get back for that. Over in my read users request, I have a few different IDs showing up. I'm going to go ahead and grab just one of them. Then I'll go over to read user. I'll swap out that portion of the URL with the ID I just copied to the clipboard. I'm going to fire that off, and this time around, I get a status code of 200, and I actually get my user object down below, which is fantastic. So now we have our resource creation endpoints for fetching all items or fetching a single item by its ID. Now, one thing you'll notice about the code down below is that I never convert my string ID into an object ID like we had to do with the MongoDB native driver when finding documents. Mongoose does many nice things for us, and one nice thing it does is that it automatically converts those string IDs into object IDs to make sure everything works correctly. So that's not the main reason we're using Mongoose. The main reason is to create those models and structure our data in a nice way, but this is definitely a nice little advantage. Now, that's where we're going to stop for this one. In the next video, it's up to you to set up 2 endpoints for fetching tasks. I'm excited to get to that, so let's jump right into the next one.